Okay, so I want to talk about what happens after the Spanish finally come up into Texas. They established in San Antonio in 1718 in a group of very, very small, very raw, unfinished missions in East Texas along the border with French Louisiana. And this speaks to that point I made in my first podcast today about uh, the border between Spanish Texas and French Louisiana becomes a hotspot. It also becomes kind of an engine of history. It generates events, is one way to think about it. So 1718, what becomes San Antonio is established. It again is very raw. It takes decades to build missions. There's a rough fort here, rudimentary, but at least there's something. There's a Spanish presence in what's now downtown San Antonio, and there's some very, very unfinished missions in East Texas. And in 1719, and there's a event which is really dumb. It's got a dumb name, but it actually has big consequences. It's called the Chicken War. I don't think any other state but Texas would have something called the Chicken War. But anyway, here's the deal. So the Spanish, there's a handful of Spanish in what's now East Texas. There are some French, and there's a global war that has broken out. And it goes on in India and Europe and Canada. It's the world's first global war. And it makes its way to the Texas-Louisiana border. And what you have is about 7 French militia come into Spanish Texas. You know, the border was very, very murky. There wasn't, the line between Spanish Texas and French Louisiana was not well marked out. But anyway, just like 7 or so French militia come in and they attack one of these newly established Spanish establishments. And there's only 2 people there. There's one lay brother and there's one Spanish soldier. So we're talking about really small stuff. And it's called the Chicken War because the French take these 2 folks captive or they run away. And then the French steal the chickens that are there that the Spanish are growing. That's why it's called the Chicken War. Okay, so why am I talking about this? This seems like one of those things that makes, history just unbearable. The reason I am this little event had enormous consequences. First of all, the handful of settlers that were in East Texas, they retreated, but this time they retreat to San Antonio instead of going back into the interior of Mexico. So it's significant. It's significant San Antonio is there. San Antonio is very raw and unfinished, but at least it's there. And so the folks that retreat, unlike the 1690s, when the Spanish retreated all the way back into the interior of Mexico, the folks that retreat in 1719, 1720, about 30 years later, a little less, they can go back to San Antonio. Okay, so again, this idea of San Antonio kind of being infrastructure for the Spanish in Texas. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the Spanish do what they always do when their Texas border with Louisiana is threatened. They freak out. They freak out. They're sure that this chicken war is a big plot on the part of the French to come in and capture Texas. And that's the last thing they want because the Spanish want Texas to be a buffer between French Louisiana and the mining areas of central Mexico. So the Spanish decide, okay, enough is enough. We are going to finally send in some real resources. We're going to spend some money on Texas. We've kind of messed around until now, but now we're going to get serious. So the Spanish appoint a very serious guy. He's the governor of Coahuila. His name is Aguayo. It's the Marquis de Aguayo. He's a huge landowner. He's a nobleman and very distinguished. And the viceroy in Mexico City, who basically runs Mexico, runs the Spanish colonies in North America for the king, he orders Aguayo to pull together a mission, pull together an expedition to march up into Texas to reinforce Spanish Texas. So Aguayo takes his time. Again, Aguayo is a very, very serious guy, very determined. He takes over a year, but he gathers together this expedition. One of the things to think about, these aren't cheap. They cost the Spanish government a lot of money, which is why the Spanish had been so reluctant to really devote resources to Texas, because there wasn't much up here. There wasn't mineral wealth, things that I have talked about. And so, but now the Spanish devote resources to Texas because they don't want to lose Texas. They don't want to lose the buffer zone. So in the early 1720s, Aguayo comes into Texas. He has 500 men with him that are mounted. He has about 4,000 or so horses and cattle. By the way, I would never test you on how many cattle and horses Aguayo brought up into Texas. But what I want to get in your head is this is serious. The Spanish are just so much more serious with Aguayo than they've ever been before. He comes into San Antonio. He reinforces the presidios in San Antonio. He establishes another mission. So he reinforces San Antonio. He goes into East Texas, recaptures the mission, which really wasn't that hard to do, from the French. He reinforces those missions. He also goes in and establishes what becomes Goliad. There's a mission there, which will become the city of Goliad. And when he leaves Texas, he leaves about 250 of his men in various presidios, and he goes back into Coahuila, and he never comes back into Texas again. But Aguayo is very, very important, because when he leaves Texas, he leaves a permanent Spanish presence in Texas. San Antonio is fortified. East Texas is fortified. The Goliad area is established. There are cattle and horses up here. This begins the cattle and horse raising industry of Texas, which is still very important today. So there's 10 missions when Aguayo leaves Texas. So he establishes more missions. He establishes more forts, presidios, the Spanish word for fort. So what Aguayo does is he reinforces the Spanish claim on Texas. And when he leaves Texas, the Spanish have a much firmer grip than they had before he came. So Aguayo is the Spanish father of Texas. He's not much talked about, but it's because of him that we have the lasting legacies of Spain that still very, very much shape Texas to this very day. He's a serious man that had a serious job, took it seriously, was very successful, and then it was like, goodbye. I've had it with Texas. I can't stress enough, if you came from the interior of Mexico, you did not want to deal with Texas. It was too remote. It was too dangerous. There was nothing, you could not make profits here. So Aguayo came in, did his job, established the Spanish claim, left, never came back.